Hello and welcome back to the guided workshop tutorial. I'm Equinox Doodles and we're going to be continuing our process of making a Rivals of Aether workshop character, the template of which is in the description below. Inside of that folder you'll also find everything that you need to get started, such as GM Edit along with the Roa dialects. That way you have everything that's actually set up for functions and what have you. You will need to update it though, as it has been recently updated to include some of the new stuffs within the new patch that came out recently. You can get this by either going to the modding resources in the Rivals of Aether Discord or in the extended workshop Rivals of Aether Discord server. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down pretty much how we make a standard attack, just one that hits once and comes right back to what we are doing before. Usually I like to start with down tilts, as down tilts tend to be the moves that I have as combo starters, because that's usually the characters I like to play. So that's what we'll be starting with today. You may also start with maybe up tilt or F tilt, any basic attack move that just has a one hit to it. This is what we're going to be covering. In the next episode, we're going to be covering moves like jab that have multiple windows, which, you know, like jab 1, jab 2, those sort of things. And then we'll later cover different unique situations for attacks, such as charge moves, and also anything that might fall into that, such as Saffron's unique jab. So first things first, let's break down how we actually organize attacks. Attacks are broken down into the attack value, the window value, and the hitbox value. You can find information for all this by going to rivalsofaether.com/hitbox grid indexes for the hitboxes and attack grid indexes for the attack values, as well as the window values. This is where you can find anything that is not covered if you want to extend a little bit of your knowledge, and you can also just find more information about anything that might have been covered but you need a little bit more clarification on. So first things first, we're going to be starting off with the attack value. So the attack value determines what the move pretty much is. So you have stuff as like AG category, which stands for attack grid category, which is the grid indexes here. It can go through 0 all the way to 2, 0 being grounded only, so you cannot use the move while in the air, 1 being aerial only, so you can only use the move in the air, and 2 being that you can use them on both the ground and in the air. All specials tend to fall under category 2, but there are certain cases where you'd want to have certain variants appear if you are on the ground or in the air, and we can also cover that in the future. AG sprite is the actual sprite for the animation, so as you see here, AG sprite, followed by the function sprite get and the string. So sprite get, as we know, goes into the actual sprites folder and looks for whatever we put into the string here, which is down tilt. So what it's pulling is the actual down tilt animation right here. Same thing with the hurtbox sprite, sets to down tilt hurt, which you can find as down tilt hurt in the actual sprites folder. The next thing that you are also going to note is that there is also AG air sprite and AG hurtbox air sprite. Those are usually only for moves if you have AG category 2, so your specials. And most cases you don't need to worry about it, but if it looks kind of goofy, you might want to make your own unique animations for that. Next is specifically for aerials, so let's pull up an aerial right now, like fair. You'll see AG has landing lag and AG landing lag. AG has landing lag. As long as it's above 0, the move will immediately cancel as soon as you hit the ground and put landing lag on you. Otherwise, the move will continue while you're on the ground. AG landing lag is the amount of frames that are given once you actually are in the landing lag state. So change this to alter the balance of your moves, especially in the air, because you want to make sure that those are actually rather decently fair. Another one that is sometimes used is AG uses custom gravity. If it's 0, it uses the default gravity of the character, but if it uses 1, you can use it as custom gravity for each window, which is what we'll be getting into soon. Last but certainly not least is a unique thing for strongs, and that's the AG strong charge window. This is when you're holding the smash or strong charge button, and you're holding that down and it's charging to make it more powerful. So let's actually go into the windows. Windows are how we break down our move into different sections. Essentially, picture a window as pretty much the area of the move that we are focusing on. So For window 1, you usually want that to be your startup frames. So that's the startup of the move. So if you picture somebody playing baseball, that would be when they're reeling the bat backwards to strike the ball. Window 2 is your active frames. Most cases, it will be your active frames because you only really need 3 windows in most cases. The more windows you have, the more control you have over the move. Just make sure that you comment them so that way you know what window does what. So this would be the bat striking the ball, which means that window 3 is the actual pullback of the bat going back into the relaxed motion. So your follow through of the actual animation. So your startup, your active frames, and then your end lag. Windows have a lot of different grid indexes that I will not be exactly going into, but you can look at those in the attack grid indexes section of the manual. It covers a lot of different things. The main things that we are going to be focusing on are the window length, the Annie frames, or Anim frames, whatever you prefer. I'm going to be calling them Annie frames because it's way easier for people to pick up on that over calling them Anim frames, in my opinion. And last but certainly not least is the has with lag, as well as the sound effects stuff here. So what does each of these do? AG window length is the actual duration of this window. So this is the amount of in-game frames before it will move to the next window. And these will always go through the actual next window. There are certain things that will change it, which is the window type, which is AG underscore window underscore type. For jabs, which we'll get into in the next few sections, which is AG window cancels, and we'll definitely touch on those, but you don't really need to worry about them for this case of the actual tutorial. So AG window length controls the in-game frames before it will move on to the next window. So as long as your num windows is equal to 3, it will go down to the 3rd window. If you had a 4th window, the move would immediately stop before it hits window 4 because there's only 3 windows. Even if there was a 4th window down here, there's only 3 that it will look at. You want to change the window length to make the move feel a little bit better or feel more powerful, etc., etc. You want to aim for a good middle balance between balance and actual game feel, because game feel is very important when making a Rivals of Aether workshop character. The Anim frames, or Annie frames, control the actual animation frames of the move. So here you see it says Anim frame 1. So if we go to our down tilt animation, we are only animating this frame. If we had it set to 2, for instance, we would be going from this animation to this one right over here. The next thing is Anim frame start, or Annie frame start as we're going to be calling it. So this selects what frame of the animation that will actually be playing. This is not to be confused with in-game frames. This is the animation frames, or the Annie frames here. So if we have our Anim frame start at 1, we're not going to be starting here. This actually in Game Maker is 0. It will actually be going right over to here. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then down here you see it says Anim frame start 2, which means that we are ending on this one, which isn't exactly what we would like. We actually want it to animate for the rest of the animation. So to do that, we are going to look back at our down tilt. It says right here, Anim frame start 2. And as we know, Anim frame 1 will only animate the frame that we are starting on. So if we are starting on 2 and Anim frame is set to 1, we're only going to be showing this animation frame. And if you go in game, I'll show you what that looks like right now. That's what it will look like if we don't change it. So as you see in the rest of the animation, we have 5 frames of animation in between these. So we want to go from 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5. So to do that, we'll just change the number to 5 and save that. And here's what that looks like in game. That's how we do our actual animation tweaking for our windows to make the animation play properly. If you end up messing this up, you might end up getting some glitches where smears appear where they shouldn't be, or you might have repeat animation frames, and we really don't want that to appear. So now you can just kind of go in and tweak the window lengths and make them to your liking. I'm just going to leave them like this for now because What we really want to focus on is the hitboxes, and good hitbox etiquette is very, very important. So all the hitbox grid indexes you can find by going to rivalsofether.com/hitbox-grid-indexes, and that will give you a ton of stuff to look at for your hitboxes. The things that we really want to focus on, because it's only going to have one hitbox, is the X and Y, the window, hitbox type, lifetime, the shape, the damage, the angle, the knockback and the knockback scaling, hit pause and hit pause scaling, as well as in some cases your HG hitbox sound effects. So let's break each of these down, going from the top to the bottom. So hitbox type, this is what kind of hitbox your hitbox is. There are two kinds. One is the physical attack, and two is projectiles. We'll be covering projectiles in a later video, but one is your melee hits, and two is your projectile hits. HG window is when the hitbox is actually created. So for this case, 2 is our active frames. This is when the move will actually have a hitbox, so we want to make sure that our window is set to 2. If you have 4 windows and maybe window 3 is actually the active frame, just change that to 3. HG lifetime is the duration that the hitbox is actually active for. So if you have a sword swipe and the sword is out for a really long time, maybe the lifetime should match that, or maybe it shouldn't. It's up to you. Usually what I like to go for is as soon as the smear is out, that's when the actual hitbox should be out, because that's when the biggest possible frame of the animation will be shown to the player. You want to make sure that whatever you do, you don't give your character small hitboxes. You want to make sure that they are big, but fairly big. Hitbox X and Y is where the hitbox will actually be drawn on, and the width and the height is the actual dimensions of the hitbox. We're going to be getting into those in a bit, so don't worry. The hitbox shape. So there are 3 different kinds of hitbox shapes. There's 0, which is the circle, 1, which is the rectangle, and 2, which is the rounded rectangle. What you use is completely dependent on the move. However, in most cases, I usually tend to go with circles and rounded rectangles. The damage, of course, is the damage of the move. The angle is what angle the move will send at. So if we set this to 90, it will send the opponent straight up into the air, as long as they don't DI. Gotta remember that characters can DI, so you want to make sure that you have an angle that is kind enough for DI. The angle that I would recommend avoiding the most, if you can, is the angles 30 and 35. We don't really like those angles, especially for players, because they're really weird to DI, so try and avoid those if possible. You might also notice I didn't say anything within the range of 30 to 35. That's because, well, Rivals of Aether hitboxes typically don't stray away from weird angles like that. You want to make sure that your angles are rounded between 0 and 5. So let's say you want an angle of 82, just round down to 80, or maybe round up to 85 if it looks a little nicer to you. The only instances where you should break that is in very specific circumstances, and even then, you rarely will ever see a difference. The knockback is the, knockback that is applied to the opponent regardless of their damage. So if you have a move that's like a Meta Knight spin or something that pulls the opponent in, like Mach Tornado, you usually want to have it to where your knockback is relatively high, so that way they stay in hit stun, but also not high enough to where they are tossed out. And you want to have relatively low knockback scaling, so that way they can actually DI out. Knockback scaling is the amount of knockback applied relative to the damage of the opponent. So base knockback will always be the same knockback if you don't have any scaling applied to it, but the scaling will make sure that that actually increases determined by the damage of the player. Essentially what this is that if we had this base knockback and no knockback scaling, an opponent at 999% will always have the same amount of knockback as somebody who would have 0 damage. The knockback scaling fixes that by applying more knockback by looking at the damage of the player. The hit pause and hit pause scaling are pretty similar to knockback, but instead of dealing knockback, it pauses the characters in whatever attack they're doing. So for those of you who don't know, there is a Rivals of Aether mechanic called hit falling. This is when you're in hit pause and you fast fall. As you know, hit pause is when the characters stop for a moment to show emphasis on how powerful the attack is. You want to make sure that the more powerful the attack, the more hit pause there is, so that way opponents can DI properly, because that's when their actual initial DI will kick in. And the hit pause scaling should relatively be okay, so when it's higher percent, they have a better chance of DIing instead of at lower percents. So how do we actually make a hitbox work? Because right now, if we go in game and we look at Guadwa's little down tilt, you might notice that the hitbox is a little weird. That's where we're going to be pulling up our hitbox helper. So just like before, we need to set the offset of our little cursor here with the right click. So we're going to go in and do 8094. So 8094 is right there. So you might be wondering, why is Guadwa green? And that is because we loaded up the hurt box for down tilt. So if we load up any kind of hurt box, it will always update to have it over the characters so we can actually see what will be able to get hit if they are in the animation. So next thing we need to do, after we loaded up our sprites and set our origin, we're going to lock it just to be safe. We're going to go to the actual animation where our hitbox should be active. So if we go to here, you'll see that our active window, window 2, starts at 1. So that would be right here. As you can see, it's numbered, nice and easy for you to follow. So 1 is right there. So this is where the hitbox should be. A weird, strange quirk that happens with the hitbox helper is that if you zoom in while there's a hitbox out, if I put that out, if I zoom in, you'll see that it becomes smaller. So just keep that in mind while you're working with hitboxes. So we're going to make a hitbox, and we're going to make sure that it is relatively fair. With our actual hitbox, as you can see, there's a little bit of green poking out, and we want to change that. As you can see, while we're messing with our hitbox is actually kind of not covering the character. So what we need to do to fix that is to make sure that we are using the correct shape. And if you click this little tool here next to the eye, which hides the hitbox, you can press it again to make it like a lower opacity. So we can change this by going to the little circle, and now it's a rectangle. Now it's a rounded rectangle. As I said before, I usually tend to like rounded rectangles, but for this case, we're going to be using a normal rectangle. So what is good hitbox etiquette? So usually a hitbox would probably look something like this if it was like early Rivals, early base workshop Rivals stuff. What this is we are essentially sync wrapping the entire hitbox around our hurtbox, and that ends up making hitboxes feel very small. So to fix that, I found a little trick, and that's with these little squares here. So the squares actually give a little bit of help here. If we make it so that way they're like a pixel above what would be the hitbox. Pull this down a little bit. It gives it a little bit more range, and it makes it feel a little less trapped. So now you have a little bit more range to it. And usually what I like to do is make sure that if I have a smear or something in my animation, I want to make sure that the hitbox goes a little bit past the smear, just to make sure that it actually hits. It's genuinely a good idea to make sure that hitboxes are slightly bigger than the animation, so that way opponents can actually be caught properly in the hits, whereas in before, they would have to be right on top of the animation to actually be hit. So now that we got everything in our hitbox helper, you might actually notice that there are a few numbers over here. This is our hitbox X, Y, width, and height. So all we have to do now is just plug in those numbers. So 47, -14 for our X and Y. And our width is 100, and our height is 36. Save that, load that up in game, and now you should see that the hitbox actually comes up and appears, just like we wanted it to. From here now we can just mess with the knockback scaling and hit pause, as well as our knockback, to make it hit where we want it to hit. Keep in mind that game feel is more important right now than trying to get it balanced, and you should be focusing on making sure your character is super fun before you try and balance it. Because no one's going to want to play a very boring character that's already been balanced to pieces. You want to make a character that's fun and a little bit overpowered, maybe a little overpowered to the overpower, if you get what I mean, before you actually go in and start asking for balanced feedback. So with that being said, this is how you do basic hitboxes. So why don't you go ahead and do a few moves by yourself, and we'll come back and we'll start talking about moves that have multiple windows to them. So your jabs and maybe your up tilts or your up airs, anything that has a hit 1 and a hit 2. So thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode.